Good morning, everybody. It's my great pleasure to introduce my friend Bruce Gordon, whom I first met 30 years ago at the Institute for European History in Mainz. I had just arrived for my fellowship year, and Bruce was finishing up his research period there, and that was very lucky for me because in order to save space in his suitcase, he was willing to pass along his Lewis and Short Latin-English dictionary, which saved me from having to write my dissertation utilizing the Institute's Latin-German dictionary. So I still have that dictionary, and it shares shelf space along in my personal Handbibliothek with several other books that are authored or edited by Bruce, so I see you often on my shelves. Bruce Gordon holds a PhD from the University of St. Andrews, and he has had appointments at the University of St. Andrews and since 2008 at Yale Divinity School and Yale University. At Yale, he is currently the Titus Street Professor of Ecclesiastical History. This spring, he was a visiting professor at the University of Geneva. He has published important biographies of Calvin and Zwingli, both with Yale University Press. He's published a history of the life of Calvin's institutes from Princeton in 2016, and key works on the Swiss Reformation from Manchester in 2002, and clerical discipline and rural Reformation, the Synod in Zurich, from Peter Lang in 1992. He's also edited or co-edited a number of essential collections, including these favorites of mine: the Oxford Handbook of Calvin and Calvinism from Oxford University Press in 2001, Following Zwingli, A Pie in the Past in Reformation Zurich, Ashgate Press, 2014. Shaping the Bible in the Reformation, Books, Scholars, and Their Readers in the 16th Century, Brill, 2012. And Protestant History and Identity, a really great two-volume set of Protestant history and identity in the 16th century by Scholar Press in 1996. Today, he will offer our concluding plenary lecture for this Congress, entitled In Returning and Rest, You Shall Be Saved, Land, Memory, and Inheritance for Huldrych, Zwingli, and Jean Calvin. Please join me in welcoming Professor Gordon to the podium.
Thank you very much, Barbara. I remember well in those last moments of being in Mainz, of having to be very generous in distributing a whole range of things to other people. And I'm so glad that the dictionary found such a good home. I'm very grateful to Karin and to the members of the Congress for the invitation to be here. I've been, like all of us, the recipient of enormous hospitality and generosity over the last few days. The only gift I'm perhaps less grateful for is that I picked up a cold this week, so I apologize if my voice seems somewhat scratchy today, but I think I'm on the mend today. Also, again, I'm very grateful to Barbara for the kind words of introduction, because Barbara's work on Calvin in its many aspects, not only in biblical exegesis, but her recent work on Calvin and history and memory has played an enormous role in the work that I have been attempting to do over the last while, thinking about the subject of my topic for today, which is patria, which is perhaps an appropriate term for on the last day of a conference, as people are thinking about going home. And that's what I want to talk about today, is the notion of patria and of land. What does it mean to return home? And I'm thinking about this in context of, I had a PowerPoint, is there? Yeah. Do I just need to press here? Here we go. And so it's for both Zwingli and Calvin, this notion of patria and of the land as significant aspects of their thought in not only of exile, but of God's inheritance and promises. So what does it mean to have a homeland? What actually constitutes a homeland? Patria, patrie, Vaterland. Many of us would struggle to answer that question. Mobility and temporary residence are realities of our contemporary world. Yet at the same time, as we all know, migration alongside climate change and war, naturally all closely related, are worldwide crises. For some, relocation is a matter of choice. I would not be living in the United States if it was not for a university position. For others, persecution, violence, and destitution force drastic decisions to undertake perilous journeys. The recent deaths of more than 500 migrants off the coast of Greece are but one more tragic reminder of the terrible human price paid for hopes for a better life. This Congress is considering the subject of exile and exiles and thinking about Jean Calvin's attitudes towards dislocation and their consequences. But we might ask, dislocation or separation from what? Is the question so easily answered? In what direction do refugees move? The 16th century reveals that those forced to flee for their convictions experienced movement in several concurrent directions, physical and spiritual. They were required to uproot and take to the roads and waterways. In exile, they were defined by where they came from, at best tolerated, frequently the victims of resentment and hostility. As conditions permitted, these individuals and communities sought to retain contact with those left behind, always in the hope or expectation of a return. This brutal worldly experience of forced removal was accompanied by spiritual and pastoral advice delivered by reformers that conceived of home in familiar and yet also unfamiliar ways. Themselves frequently exiles, many Protestant reformers understood the enduring pull of homeland, patria. Yet exile and refuge were closely associated with the preservation of true faith and the avoidance of idolatry. Calvin famously counseled the faithful in France to exile or martyrdom. These outward demonstrations of fidelity were closely aligned to the central Reformed concept of pilgrimage, about which we've already heard something, peregrinatio, embedded in the doctrine of sanctification, in which the outward life expressed inward movement towards unity with Christ and reaching the true patria. Unlike the villages and cities that they left behind, for many men and women stranded in foreign lands, the homeland promised by the reformers was a land they had never seen. Going back meant going forward. For refugees of the 16th century, home meant looking both ways. You could find your patria without ever returning to the place of origin. Yet there was the constant longing for abandoned family, community, and livelihood. The idea of patria, so strong in the Roman literary and legal traditions, became a powerful part of Reformed Christianity, formed in an age of persecution and religious wars. The term was always multivalent, reflective of diverse ideals and aspirations. I want to explore how the Reformed tenets of peregrinatio and patria revealed the close relationship of the spiritual and material, of the interior and external worlds. They conveyed a powerful connection to divine providence, creation, multiple senses of identity in the early modern world, and the centrality of the sanctified life and the journey to eternity. Beginning with the generation of Huldrych Zwingli and the emergence of Reformed thought in the 1520s, the emphasis on sanctification cast the life of a Christian as a sojourn or pilgrimage. The movement of faithful men and women was towards a heavenly homeland, patria, understood as integration into Christ's body and the restoration of community as the outward expression of that body. The conviction informed all aspects of emergent Reformed theology, including the Eucharist and the covenant. Beginning in Zurich and Basel, the Lord's Supper was described in the liturgy as an action, became a symbol of lives in motion, an expression of the body of Christ in community. Writing of the Eucharist in his Subsidium of August 1525, Zwingli, commenting on Genesis 17, made the direct connection between the new covenant of the cup and the Abrahamic covenant that promised the people an everlasting inheritance after their peregrinations. Clearly, little of this was new to the Reformation, and the Reformers understood themselves as drawing from the well of biblical and patristic thought. As I shall suggest, it was to their beloved Augustine that they turned. But the concepts of Christian life as peregrinatio had, of course, deep roots in medieval theology and vernacular culture. To this we must add the humanist language of patria. Towards the end of his life, Huldrych Zwingli, writing against Caspar Schwenkfeld, employed an ancient euphemism he likely took from Erasmus's adages. He who constantly changes his homeland, patria, accomplishes no more than a stone continually rolled gathers moss. I want to explore this sense of movement and materiality through two figures of the Reformation with perspectives both divergent and shared. Huldrych Zwingli and Jean Calvin naturally belonged to different generations of the 16th century Reform movement and distinct moments within the religious experiences of the age. My point of comparison is perhaps somewhat different. It is not my intention to reflect on what might or might not have been their relationship, which Calvin repeatedly insisted was non-existent. Rather, I want to think about these two reformers from the perspective of questions with which I have opened. Notably, what constitutes a homeland, patria, and what that physically and spiritually meant. I use patria in the multiple senses in which they did, and follow the distinctions that they made from land as terra. One sense, however, is unambiguous. The true homeland, patria, for Christians is heaven. It can, however, be partially experienced in this world through the pilgrimage towards the fullness of unity in Christ. For the faithful, it is the object of longing, occasionally glimpsed and performed in the life of the church. In this world, sojourners have assurance, but only will fully dwell in their patria in the next life. That did not, however, diminish its importance on this side of death. Both Zwingli and Calvin understood themselves as exiles. Both retained strong attachments to their patria. In the case of the Frenchman, that self-identity is well known and frequently recalled as central to his life and ministry. Famously, Calvin preached regularly to the swelling population of his French co-religionists in Geneva. As Bill Nafy and others have long ago shown us, and more recently in work, the presence of refugees in the city was both a source of support for Calvin and a cause of ongoing acrimony. When he wrote his 1559 Latin Institutes, we all know the Frenchman explicitly had in mind those training for the ministry and who would return to France and often die for their faith. But in what respect was Zwingli an exile? He is generally portrayed rather differently from Calvin and from the French refugees of a later generation. The Swiss priest remained in his native Swiss Confederation and died suddenly for his vision of a reform of his homeland. He is routinely, however, described as a patriot, an expression cultivated by 19th century nationalism and a deeply problematic term. Surely Zwingli was the consummate local reformer. But was he? He naturally closely associated with the city of Zurich, where he lived from 1519 until his death in 1521. But in Swiss terms and in his own mind, he too was in a form of exile, separated from his Vaterland, which is the word he uses. To the end of his life, Zwingli regarded not Zurich, but his native Toggenburg, as his true patria. This might seem insignificant to us in the vast lands of North America, given their relative proximity, but the distinctions were defining. Zwingli had been identifiable in Zurich by his accent and close association with the peasantry. It was an identity he carefully cultivated. But it was also a statement of difference from the urban commercial culture that he occupied as a priest and leading preacher, and of which he was a vocal critic. The language of peasantry was carefully employed in his call for social reform. Although Zwingli was a citizen in Zurich, the city was never the center for his source of identity. He gave it no particular religious role other than as a force for reformation in the Confederation. His call was carefully crafted around the idea of a peasant summoned to a foreign city. In a preface to an anonymous writing by a Swiss peasant, Zwingli reiterated his argument that the unlearned rural people were frequently better able to understand and preach the gospel than the educated civic priests. The biblical prophetic parallels, we might think of Jonah, were carefully intended. In his 1524 letter to the leaders of the native Toggenburg, Zwingli complained of his situation where, quote, righteous people of Zurich have not treated me well, even though I am eager to let the power of God prevail and yet not cast pearls before swine. It's a very low voltage PowerPoint. I just have here the quotations that I'm going to be using. And just quickly to note that the translations are mine with the exception of the citation from Calvin's dedication of his Daniel lectures. Zwingli's intention was to instruct his fellow Toggenburgers in the gospel, but his current troubles rendered him, he said, impossible to return. I won't read all these quotations, you can see them here. The other reason that I have always intended to teach the gospel of Christ among you as in my homeland, Vaterland. However, I have constantly been hindered by the pretext that is being put forward against me. Not that I care so much for myself or for my concerns, for I trust that you will protect me. So there is this language here that he is a distant prophet from his fatherland, from which he has to cultivate a relationship of distance. In lieu of a return, the letter takes the form of a sermon to be shared amongst the kinsmen, in which he outlines the Christian life. Zwingli continuously through his life saw himself as a peasant prophet, unwillingly separated from his homeland. Patria, land, separation, longing, pilgrimage provide us, I believe, with a vocabulary for speaking about Zwingli and Calvin and a topography of salvation. We encounter similarities and striking differences. Zwingli, as we shall see, saw his native Swiss lands as a locus of godly living. It was a lost Arcadia that now with the gospel preached could be recovered through a true relationship between piety and the land. Calvin had no such language for France. There was no golden age, and the land was thoroughly contaminated by idolatry. Yet, as Max Angermar has shown us, frequently Calvin made reference to his native France and identified himself with the land of his birth. Calvin had a different set of references for the relationship between land and God's will. The shared inheritance for both reformers, I would argue, lies in Augustine's extensive treatment of patria in his writings. Both Calvin and Zwingli, as we know, were students of the North African father, but they were so within a broad range of influences, notably scholasticism and local cultural traditions. Key themes inherited by the reformers from the Augustinian tradition were appropriated and reformulated within specific circumstances in the 16th century. I begin with the theological pastoral conception of Augustine, who, as I've said, had a great deal to say about patria in terms of both doctrine and his own life. Some have recently argued the concept of patria was central to Augustine's rejection of Platonism that brought him to the scriptures. In books 7 and 8 of the Confessions, he describes Platonists as travelers who can only see their patria from afar. Rather than take the safe route guaranteed by the Emperor, Christ, they attempt to find a shortcut through the woods, but they are always frustrated. You can see here in the quotation. It is another thing to hold on to the way that leads there, defend the protection of the heavenly emperor. There are no deserters from the heavenly army waiting to attack. For this way they hate like a torture. This is, as Augustine describes, the Platonists who catch a glimpse of the homeland, of the patria. The Platonists encounter robbers and thieves who thwart their efforts to reach what they have faintly seen. The robbers and thieves, of course, are humanity's fallen nature and the absence of faith. They lack revelation. The fundamental impediment is pride. Pride, superbia of the Platonists binds them to one possible path, laid down by God to their patria. They vainly rely on their own wisdom. For Augustine, reaching humanity's patria is about movement. The journey is peregrinatio, pilgrimage. The seeking of a patria is not primarily about the return to a past or a previous home. Calvin shared with Augustine the belief that pilgrimage is a daily, step-by-step progress towards Christ. The idea was profoundly pastoral. While it was possible for some pilgrims, exiles, and refugees to come home, for which it was natural to hope, for many this will never happen. As we shall see with Calvin, God's punishment of exile cannot be separated from the promise of restoration. But the timing of any return is not known, and it is entirely possible that many generations will die away from their homes. Calvin speaks of the original Jewish exiles in Babylon dying in exile, and that among their descendants the memory of the homeland would be lost. Loss of memory, however, did not diminish God's promise of eventual return. The further generations of exiles did not die outside the promise, as Calvin is at pains to explain. Their patria had to be considered in another way. In Confessions 10, Augustine writes that we long for a homeland, but that does not mean that we have already dwelt in its borders. Our homeland is a land that we do not yet know. Human existence for Augustine, Zwingli, and Calvin were both exile and peregrinatio. The whole of life in this world is one of exile. In Book 3 of the Institutes, Calvin writes, "Indeed, if our heaven is our true homeland, patria, then what else is the earth but a place of exile? If migration from the world is entry into life, what else?" I think I have this. What else? If immigration is from the world is an entry into life, what else is the world but a tomb? To this he added, "If we consider that through death we are recalled from exile to our homeland and dwell in the heavenly homeland, will we not obtain great consolation from that?" The homeland is where God and the human person will be fully one, united. It will be reached on the other side of life. But seeking that homeland is essential for the sojourner in this world. That exile for Augustine was about ultimate reunion in heaven, but that does not undermine that exile in this world will be wretched and involve suffering. Sorrow accompanies hopeful expectation. Once more, Calvin shared this language of the struggle of this life as an essential part of the journey to a bliss known only after death. In his sermon on Genesis delivered in January 1560, which I've taken this passage from Max's work, he tells the people, "However, we must take after our father Abraham in being pilgrims here below. It is necessary, as I have said, for everyone to travel through different regions. But we must have one foot raised, that we may not be attached to the earth, but rather that we may be citizens of heaven, even though we must dwell here below for a time. Therefore, this is what we have to observe in the second place, to conform ourselves to the example of Abraham." Revelation and hope ensure that the patria can be glimpsed in this world and anticipated with certainty. Neither Augustine nor Calvin placed any particular value on the patria, the vision of the patria in this life. One does not have to have a John Bunyan-like appearance. It is sufficient to be certain of its reality. Zwingli, it could be argued, saw in the beauty of nature a more visual representation of the eternal homeland. Augustine and Calvin were much more focused on patria as a place to be inhabited, because the essence of coming home was to fully participate in the divine life. Christ is both the way, who, unlike for the Platonists, offers both a clear path to the patria, and is also the end himself. In Calvin's language, the pilgrim is gradually engrafted and transformed into the likeness of Christ. Augustine had made a similar point. A person who is not in that homeland but does not believe is not even on the way there. Let us walk then like people who know they are on the way, because the King of our homeland has made himself our way. Humans pursue what they find beautiful, but that is not necessarily the way of Christ to patria. Fellowship in patria is with God and with neighbors. Therefore, those who seek to enter into the journey must do so within the church. It is the essential fellowship of the sojourners. Church and patria have, for Augustine, Calvin, and Zwingli, powerful bodily metaphors. The church is the womb. The patria is the outside world into which the person is born. The church forms the people for a life in the homeland. The church births the person sacramentally. The sacraments of birth and the Eucharist sustain the sojourner in the world. In his final confession, prepared for Francis I, which we've already had a citation from earlier in the week, prepared for Francis I in 1531, Zwingli argued that the created world guides the faithful towards the heavenly patria. His reflections fall within a wider argument against the Anabaptist teaching that the soul falls asleep at the moment of death. He writes, As soon as the human soul enters the body, it immediately lives, grows, moves, and exercises all the functions of life. How then could it be that the soul, once freed from the body, would become sluggish or fall asleep? Philosophers refer to the soul as the activity or action, indicating its vivacity and wakefulness. That is, its perpetual operation and power, this emphasis on movement. The concept is expressed by the Greeks. And I just jump forward. Visible things in the world have been arranged by divine providence in such an order that through them the human mind can ascend to the knowledge of invisible things. During the journey, or in Zwingli's more Platonic language of ascent, the Christian senses the appeal and the promise of what the patria holds. My argument is that the theological and vernacular ideas of patria were integral to the prism-like nature of identity in the Reformation. If Augustine provided a significant part of the theological framework for the Reformed idea of patria, I suggest we could look very briefly at Basel to consider how theological and pastoral ideas of homeland were deeply intertwined with components of identity that mixed with vernacular ideas of attachment to land and language, for example, such as the complexity of patria in the 16th century. For example, we generally think of Erasmus as a Dutchman. Through his life, his sense of identity. Through his life, however, his sense of identity was somewhat fluid. In his early years, was not infrequently, he referred to himself as a German, identifying his place within the empire. What did he mean by Germania has been much debated, but he clearly placed his native Low Countries within a wider imperial context. By 1521, however, we see a different formulation of language in which he was increasingly distancing himself from German lands and portrays himself more as a foreigner. And he also, while residing in Basel, makes it very clear that Basel is a Swiss city, not a German one. Indeed, between 1514 and 1516, he increasingly moves towards a clear identification of his Dutch identity. We need to be very careful, as has been pointed out, about essentializing any of these terms in our modern notions of national identity. In the 16th century, as we know, they were fluid and interchangeable and had nothing to do with modern notions of kind of nationalism. When Erasmus speaks of himself as a Hollander, it had a lot to do with issues of locality and dialect of language. Like the spiritual concept of patria, ideas of attachment were in constant state of becoming. Whereas Augustine provided, as I say, a clear sense of identity in Christianizing the notion of patria, Erasmus reminds us that identity in the 16th century was not easily translated into our modern terms. Linguistic, cultural, and political boundaries were not fixed, and terms such as Germanic, Gallic, or Netherlandish were not static designations. This leads me to Erasmus's disciple Zwingli. At first glance, as I've mentioned before, it might seem unambiguous that Zwingli was Swiss. But even that idea is far more fragmented than we might expect. I want to explore what ideas of land, Vaterland, again his term, and country meant for Zwingli and the roles they played in the development of his thought. The relationship between Zwingli and land is complex. I believe that he argued within a Swiss context, drawing on the history and geography of his own land, but without limiting his intentions to the specifically native. His arguments found a historical and theological formulation that for Zwingli drew upon the local to make a more general point about the nature of Christianity and the urgency of reform. What those arguments do not amount to, and this is a position that I've changed perhaps even slightly from when I did the biography, is that I do not believe that Zwingli had a clear sense of the Swiss as any kind of particularly elect people. In 1522, when Zwingli emerged as what we might now call a reformer, in light of the break with Rome and the renunciation of his priestly office, the tumult caused by his preaching and the spread of the evangelically minded supporters led to the first efforts to condemn him and isolate the city of Zurich. In 1524, he wrote an admonition to the Swiss Confederation, or his fellow Confederates, addressing a range of issues that would shape his thinking about questions of land, piety, and devotion. He positioned himself at the opening. Even though I do not currently reside in my homeland, he wrote in German, so he uses the word Vaterland, the praiseworthy Confederation has never left my heart. Notice this sense of separation with which he opens the address. Your happiness has always brought me great joy, and your misfortune deeply offended me. Therefore, you will, I hope, consider my simple and sincere writing not as the wise words or knowledge, but as an expression of the true sentiments of my heart, which I trust you will accept as good. His homeland or patria, of course, as I've said before, was Toggenburg, not Zurich, and Zwingli immediately explained how he might speak as a Confederate separated from his Vaterland. The principal thrust of his argument was to draw a comparison between a golden past and a sordid present. Zwingli acknowledged or invoked the world of forefathers as a time of virtue and piety, embodied in the medieval ascetic Bruder Klaus, who lived from 1417 to 1487. The evocation, it is this saintly-like ascetic figure was for Zwingli a very powerful image of what he still saw as the strength of medieval Christianity. The evocation of a common Swiss history was a shared inheritance, not as a singular marker of divine favor. Zwingli made no claim for the exclusivity of the Swiss past, Rather, he made appeal to the Israelites of the Hebrew Bible as an analogy of faith, rather than a direct inheritance or special covenant. Before, the forefathers or rural peasants embodied the pietas of a true Christian faith. The great achievement of earlier generations was their defense of liberty and enduring resistance to tyranny. He writes, here we go. Although God has bestowed much favor and grace upon our ancestors that they freed themselves from the oppressive nobility and lived together in brothers, they achieved great honor and prosperity. Such virtue, I'm not going to read the whole quotation, but such virtue brought about the fall. Unable to break the will of the brave Swiss, foreign rulers resorted to bribery with gifts, and moral decline was swift. Tempted by such worldly offers, the Swiss, in a language echoing the biblical fall, quickly divided, Zwingli writes, setting fathers and sons, brothers against brothers, and comrades and neighbors were incited against each other. The receiving of gifts in return for favors and raising of mercenary soldiers was a principal source of the rot besetting Swiss society and destroying the Confederation. Zwingli writes, for gifts also blind the eyes of the wise and pervert the words of the righteous. At root was self-interest. Self-interest not only distinguished contemporaries from their ancestors, but desecrated the land. And that's something I want to... So this notion between ancestry and the land is very important. The land, for Zwingli, revealed God's providential purpose. In his commentary on Psalm... I think I might not have this passage, also I'll read it too. In his commentary on Psalm 104, he wrote of David, he portrays both the wisdom and providence of God so that you see as God as creator, balancing the mountains in his right mighty hand and putting each in place, drawing out the valleys between the cool streams and spreading the fields, thrusting back the turbulent sea into its depths, so that there may be no confusion from its unruliness. He then assigned settlers to each region, providing abundant provisions. Sin, in contrast, had destroyed the land, the place of honest labors, of cultivating the land, terra, and living close to nature. The growth of trade and commerce led people to markets for luxury goods, which Zwingli closely associated with the corruption of urban economies. The agrarian life, he always maintained, was much closer to godliness than the corrupting of commerce. The contrast was stark. He writes, no one wants to engage in labor anymore. Many estates lie neglected and deserted, lacking laborers, even though there is ample population and fertile land that can provide you with abundant resources. Instead of trading luxury items like amber, cloves, cinnamon, oranges, silk, and indulgences, trade in cattle, horses, milk, sheep, wool, linen, wine, and grain, which are plentiful in your lands, and through such trade acquire what you lack and others need. Zwingli closely associated the Christian life with manual labor and proximity to the land. Here we find the way in which he connects patria and terra. Commerce and trade were inherently dangerous because they were befouled by self-interest. In his mind, the work of the peasant was about providing what was essential. Quote, yet labor is a good and divine thing. It prevents indulgence and vices and produces good fruit so that a person can sustain their body with clean food without resorting to the blood of the innocent or excess. It makes the body fruitful and strong and consumes the superfluous. He goes on to say that labor results, the separation of the person from labor results in idleness. Quote again, just as the hand of God brought all things to life in the beginning of creation, so the laborer in external matters is more godlike than anyone else in the world today. Calvin similarly uses the term patria in a variety of ways. We have already noted that, like Zwingli, he adopted the Augustan concept of patria as eternal homeland. As for Zwingli, patria was also a land of origin. But the Frenchman, unlike the Swiss, did not make the connection with traditional piety. In his dedicatory preface to Francis I, which is very well known to all of us, he sets out a different tone from Zwingli. He writes, "Do not think that I am here preparing a personal defense to secure my safe return to my homeland, patria. Although I pursue it with appropriate sentiment of human kindness, the current circumstances are such that I do not greatly lack it." More than 2 decades later, in his lectures on Daniel in the late 1550s, he responded to the question of returning to his native land. Again, the words are well known. "Although I have been absent these 26 years with little regret from that native land, which I own in common with yourselves, and with agreeable climate attracts many foreigners from the distant quarters of the earth." You have the rest of the quotation here. Land, however, played, I believe, a crucial role in Calvin's thinking about the relationship between place, distance, memory, and restoration. His later writings on the prophets are rich sources for thinking about Calvin and his intense interest in geography and the economy of salvation. Central to the discussion, as we've heard on various occasions this week, is the Babylonian exile of the inhabitants of Israel and Judah, exile as punishment. One of the key themes for Calvin was location. The error of the children of Israel, he argued, was to believe that those who were forced to leave the land were being especially punished. He makes this point in the Daniel lectures. For what at first sight is more unbecoming than that the youths endued with almost angelic virtues should be the slaves and captives of a proud conqueror, when the most wicked and abandoned despisers of God remained at home in perfect safety? Was this the reward of a pious and innocent life, that while the impious were sweetly flattering themselves through their escape from punishment, the saints would pay the penalty which they had deserved? This contrast between, he continually speaks about how those who were left behind think that they have been spared judgment, while that judgment has fallen on those who were taken into exile. Exile was God's punishment for idolatry, and those removed from the land paid a particular price, a price that Calvin described in detail. They suffered a terrible fate for which they had not been solely responsible. Calvin will not allow that those who remained had any case for celebration and falsely believed that they had been spared. In fact, in many ways, the Frenchman had his harshest words for them. Calvin spoke of the land in two related ways: the land as the divine inheritance and its defilement of the idolatry of God's people. Separation from the land was being cut off from the inheritance, which Calvin closely associated with separation from family, community, and worship, a forced absence from which all that which the people knew. But the land is not merely countryside, but signified home, both terra and patria, and God's promises. At the same time, the land represented the extent of the contagion. Calvin spoke of the land as wholly poisoned. The exiles were removed from that poison, which was actually in some ways a blessing. Those who remained and continued their abominations continued to lay waste to the land. As Barbara Pitkin has recently argued, the autobiographical elements of these remarks are important, given the context in which Calvin was speaking to refugees in Geneva. And she has explored the exegetical work in terms of a mirror, which is incredibly helpful. Being forced to leave the land was not a particular punishment. In fact, as Calvin developed his argument, it turns out that almost the opposite is the case. The more grievous sinners were those who remained in Jerusalem and continued their abuse of the temple with their immoral conduct. The whole of the land, as I say, was poisoned. Calvin's description of the land into which the exiles go is at points in his unfinished lectures on Ezekiel as peaceful and beautiful. This complicated the argument. He stressed that being taken into exile, the Jewish people were amazed by how rich were the lands of Assyria and Babylon. They encountered the enormous fruitfulness of these astonishing countries. Calvin spoke of their sense of being, as he terms it, awakened by the fecundity of the land. They were even allowed to live in peace. What was the relationship between the beauty of the land and exile? The theme comes up repeatedly in the Ezekiel lectures. The foreign lands into which the exiles were taken were terra, apart from patria. Yet those lands played a crucial role in God's redemptive purpose. Their beauty and barrenness were ways through which God addressed the people. The different terrains of the land, Calvin argued, acted upon the exiles in different ways. The richness of the Assyrian and Babylonian lands created a sense of safety. But at other times, the exiles were led through a desert through which they were reminded of punishment. Desert for Calvin was an image used to demonstrate where God speaks more directly to the people. I'm not going to read this whole quotation, but it is highly fitting that the desert was placed before the eyes of the Israelites, for it was not far from their own region, this notion of memory in exile. In the midst of Assyria, since they were frequent journeys, and the desert could not be unknown to them. When they were already in exile, they passed through that desert, and the diversity of regions could awaken, that word that I mentioned before, their senses even more. For the whole of Assyria was a fertile region, and Antioch had an exceptional location, as the geographers report. Therefore, when the Israelites traveled through a pleasant and opulent land and then entered a vast and desolate land, that sight could awaken them even more. Sight, awakening, than the land, memory. Calvin, as we know, took a great deal of interest in geography and topography of the lands into which the exiles were taken. He wrote of how God names the lands according to their qualities, which were expressions of his gifts. The land of exile physically manifests God's will. They too are, in his words, theaters. Greatest of all was Israel. Even though it was encompassed by many regions, it shone most by the grace of God and was the most beautiful part of that theater, which attracted and moved the eyes of all who stirred the admirations of the heart. But the key point Calvin wanted to make was that God's judgment of the land was not confined to Israel and Judah. God was the ruler of all lands and speaks to the exiles through each individual land into which they had been taken. God was not limited to any particular region. Calvin argued that this was that because the young Ezekiel and Daniel went into exile, his prophetic voice was among the exiles, that God was speaking to them directly in exile. The error of those who remained, as I said before, was to believe that God was present to them primarily through the temple. I want to conclude by saying something which has been brought up in an earlier paper about the complexity for Calvin of return. Calvin wants to argue that the exiled lands in different ways were also the location of God's authority and judgment, and that return is not possible until the land has been restored. Here, something more excellent is added. They will be sincere worshipers who will not only offer sacrifices in the temple, but also cleanse the land, terra, from all defilements. The prophet here reminds us of the great and detestable impiety of the 10 tribes, which had been contaminated by the idols. And then in the last line, thus the prophet exhorted the people to repentance, showing that they were not expelled from the land until it had been polluted, and that a just punishment had been taken for their sacrilege. The passage points us to Calvin's relationship between terra and homeland, patria, which often seems to be used interchangeably, but I would argue that there are significant spiritual distinctions. Restoration is only possible when terra and patria are reconciled, placed in their proper relationship. In exile, they had been disordered. The fulfillment of God's promise in return is a proper relationship of terra and patria. Terra must be cleansed for the earthly patria to be restored, even in its contingent form. This is the point Calvin had made to King Francis. Calvin reminded his audience that terra yielded God's blessings and carried out divine judgment. It was not in itself the source of God's favor. Appearances could be deceptive. He asked why Daniel and his colleagues appeared so healthy when they lived only in pulses and grains and did not eat and drink the rich foods of the land. Calvin remarked that no medical doctor would recommend the diet that they followed, yet they were, quote, ruddy and plump and even remarkably robust. His point was that the fruits of the land are God's blessing and intended for use, but the human relationship must be determined by pious disposition, the relationship between land and the people. For just as temperance, he writes, is not the food itself, but in the palate, because if pleasures entice us to desire bad foods, we are nevertheless intemperate. Likewise, we take part of the best foods. It does not hinder our temperance. Calvin offered an everyday observation to prove the inversion. For sometimes we shall see, I think I have this quotation here. Yes. For sometimes we shall see the children of the wealthy be thin, even though they are considered the object of their parents' utmost care. We shall see among the rustic common children that they are beautiful children, with well-filled faces and plump bodies, and that they eat any kind of food, sometimes the most harmful ones. Through true worship and temperate living, the terra is cleansed and once more becomes a vision of the earthly patria. There is a lot more to say, and I spent a lot of my time in Geneva working on a number of texts. But I want to end by noting that in the Daniel lectures, Calvin warned about the complexities of returning to the land after exile. He suggested that the exiles could be excused for not even wanting to return. As far, he quotes, as common sense would guide them, it is easier for them not to set foot to return from Assyria and other parts of the east, since their neighbors in their own country were all hostile to them. The land had been so scarred by idolatry that social and political order had been corrupted. Calvin had very much in mind the real-life experience of refugees for whom any return home would be fraught with difficulties. There are no easy promises. One could think here today of what might pass in Ukraine and the complex rebuilding when the time comes. In the exile's absence, those who remained had claimed their possessions and goods. Further exploration of the subject, and I suggest that I am myself very much in progress here. Further exploration of this subject will need to consider more fully the integration of patria and terra in their spiritual and theologic, mnemonic, and vernacular experiences and expressions. Exile has long been a topic for historians and theologians of the Reformed faith. In thinking about close connections of land, homeland, memory, scholars of Reformed Christianity, I believe, have exciting opportunities to contribute to discussions of religious self-understanding and identity formation in the early modern world. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Bruce. That was really amazing and tied together so many themes we've been thinking about and discussing. So I'm sure you're willing to take some questions.
Sure. I'm
Okay.
not leaving.
You're not leaving.
No,
You're not going out. You can go put your paper down.
Per grazia, I'm going out the door. So.
And Sam is going around with the microphone if someone would like to ask a question or make a comment. Amy.
Thank you, Bruce, for a really interesting lecture, and especially your closing remarks and putting together Zwingli and Calvin in this is quite refreshing, and then thinking about what this means for larger reform perspective. But let's go back to the first peregrinatio that they've all got, which is the Academica peregrinatio.
Yeah.
Because none of the first generation really ended up in where they started out.
No, it's absolutely right. I mean, even in my own sort of terrain, you look at the circle that Zwingli builds in Basel as well. They're all foreigners. And one of the most dramatic examples of it is when Andreas Bodenstein von Karlstadt comes to Zurich and he preaches in the Grossmünster, and people say, we can't understand anything he's saying. His Saxon is incomprehensible. And it just reminds you, I mean, and Zwingli was always treated we know about this, of course, with Calvin in Geneva, but Zwingli likewise, several times he was beaten up on the street as a foreigner. There was intense hostility about this person who, to our mind, if you take the train, 45 minutes away, you're in Glarus. But in this world, that was a world away. And he was a foreigner who spoke with a foreign accent. He was an outsider. And here he was telling them how they should, it's a story familiar to Geneva. He's telling them how they should change everything. This idea that somehow Zwingli controlled Zurich is like Geneva, simply not true. He was constantly seen as this, by many, as this unwanted outsider. But the whole circle, whether you think of Pelikan or Bullinger is in somewhat an exception. He's from a relatively close, but the whole circle were people who had been trained exactly somewhere else.
Yeah, and please do say your name before you.
Philip Baum.
Mm-hmm.
Especially in the conclusion, I began to reflect on Solzhenitsyn, a contemporary example, who did not want to live in a lawless, atheist Soviet Union, was exiled, and said, I will not return until it has collapsed. And he does returns, but he calls for repentance.
Yes.
And a moral renewal
of
the Christian foundations.
Yes.
So it's a beautiful example of a 20th century Christian.
Yes. I mean, it's a very powerful story. I might just add that he found, when he went into exile, he went into Vermont, which is where I live now, and he had this wonderful farm not very far from where we live, where he would walk and write. But he always said, although he loved Vermont, he was in exile from his real patria. And when it was possible for him to go back, he did, and obviously it was a very complicated story. But he lived in this beautiful area, as I've seen the farm, but he was in exile. It's somewhat reminded of Babylonia and Assyria. He was in exile in a beautiful place, but it was...
Bruce, thank you for a great lecture that brings together so many threads.
There you go.
Scott Manich.
Yeah.
Really enjoyed your lecture. Could you say a little more about Calvin and Abraham, and what does Abraham represent for Calvin? His name has appeared, the patriarch has appeared in a number of different lectures and places. In terms of peregrinatio, in terms of exile, pilgrim, how do you see Calvin reflecting on Father Abraham?
Yeah, he reflects a lot, as you know very well. This is the ultimate peregrinatio faith of the long journey that's undertaken, this sort of into the unknown, and I think in many ways it's probably the quintessential story for Calvin because of not really knowing where you're going, but the utter faith of making the journey, that this becomes the sort of model of the peregrinatio towards the patria for Calvin. It really stresses that in pilgrimage or in exile, there is both this leaving behind, but there is that it's also a journey to what we can only glimpse in this life, but will have fulfillment. But that journey is to a world that we can only anticipate but do not yet know. And in that notion of Abraham, of undertaking from Ur to this following God, that I would say, you're absolutely right in bringing this up. I think it's for Calvin the supreme example of the peregrinatio to the patria. And then, of course, the promise.
I think Michael, Bruning, then Eric, and then Junsuk.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Bruce. I'm just going to ask a question about a different term, which is natio. And I wonder if you encountered that. Then what prompts this is, I believe there's at least one spot where I ran across Viret writing to Calvin about nostra natio.
Yes.
And of course, Viret's from the Pays de Vaud, Calvin's from France. They share neither patria nor terra.
Yeah.
And yet they see themselves apparently as part of the same nation.
Yes, absolutely.
And is that because, and I think he's using it in opposition to those Germans, basically.
Yes.
But it might be, I just wonder if you have any thoughts.
I think that's another part of this that could certainly be developed, because I mentioned only very briefly the role of the church as the kind of corporate aspect of this, of the kind of the bodily nature of this relationship. But I think another area that would be very fruitful, and I actually did some work on, but it didn't make it into the final version, is, for instance, this idea that they're dispersed in different places, and that it is friendship that holds this together, and that friendship is this integral aspect of the kind of pilgrimage, that you're separated by time and space, and you don't occupy, as you say, the same terra, but that there is this kind of bond that holds them together, which I think is integral to this idea. So I think that's actually very helpful to bring up that term, and I would need to look more on it. But I think it very much goes in that direction.
Great. Eric.
Yes, thank you, Bruce. Erik de Boer. Thank you for the, I would say, intensity of your lecture.
Is that a good thing?
Well, yes, it's a good thing, and even the diction that you use, literary, it evokes a certain spirituality, I would say, of Zwingli, of Calvin, if that is correct. I was yesterday with Don Cinema looking at the travel diaries of the Swiss delegates going to the Sint of Dort, and there's quite a number of those diaries. So they really described their travels in great detail. Is it possible that the spirituality that you evoke is the spirituality of older men, Zwingli, Calvin, who have a life's experience, who work in a foreign territory, while the traveling is an aspect that brings more joyous thoughts to the program? Would inclusion of traveling maybe be part of your work?
I think thank you, Eric. That's a wonderful thought. The first thing that comes to mind, sorry, my voice is cracking, but the first thing that comes to mind in this respect comes very much out of that Erasmian context, which is the chronicle of Conrad Pelikan, which he describes in great detail his youthful travels and the incidents of, for instance, meeting a Jewish scholar on a road who gives him a Torah, and the influence that this has, and that this isn't just travel literature, but it's a deeply spiritual account of his formation. Spiritual formation. Obviously, it leads towards a certain goal, but the way in which he recounts his life in the Franciscan house, which is by no means negative. He doesn't rail against the Franciscans, but actually sees that as an integral part of his spiritual. And he travels around the various Franciscan because he has a significant role in the Franciscan order. And so travel. Another person that I think of in this, whose letters are quite fascinating about his travel is Sebastian Munster, who writes about, again, his travels. And sometimes they were object of great fear. You know, he talks about riding through the woods, and that it's a very frightening experience, but it's also written in deeply spiritual, formative ways. I think this is a wonderful way that, you know, one could go with this project, is integrating the notion of physical travel as part of this notion of peregrinatio. Obviously, that has deep roots in both the early and medieval Christianity. It's nothing new in the 16th century, but I think a further extension of this subject that thinks about the spiritual qualities of physical travel would be essential. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for a rich and to me it's a quite poetic presentation, and which made me think of personally. It's all the dying and death thing in Christian history, but at the same time made me think of the history of Korean or other Asian immigration to this country or the other Western countries. Mm-hmm. In relation to that, you know, one of your points. That leaving homeland can be, or the staying in homeland can be, in fact, poison. Mm-hmm. You know, while the leaving homeland, the fatherland, can be blessing. Mm-hmm. And I think it really makes sense to many of immigrants in this country. Yeah. And in relation to that, I also have to think about, you know, more and more migrations to Korea these days, and we'll be expecting by 2050 about 10% of our population will be composed of migrants. Mm-hmm. So, you know, we are not so ready. You know, some of you may know Koreans are very cultural, and we always were proud of, you know, one blood, one nation kind of a country. So we are now faced much challenge in terms of how we integrate, you know, these different kinds of migrants to Korea. Anyway, so this idea of a poison, you know, was so fascinating to me, and I like to. I may have missed, but the source and some more elaboration on this point.
Yeah,
thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's very poignant. The relationship. What I wanted to suggest is the relationship between the land and the people is very complex, and I think what we can take from Zwingli, Calvin, and of course these are just two representatives, as Richard reminds us yesterday, of a much broader range of writing on this subject. I'm very aware that I've, in a way, just pulled two people out of this. But it's for both, the relationship of the land is complex and has many dimensions to it, and there are no simple either or arguments. It's not that the people left behind have been spared or will be, that the judgment has not been passed on them. And it's not, and Calvin it goes to great lengths to say that the people who have left have been particularly punished. As he points out, you know, prophets like Daniel and Ezekiel go into exile, and God speaks through them. God is very present with the exiles. The way I read it is, it's not that one or the other is necessarily better. The judgment is on all, for the culpability is on all. The promise will come when the people repent and the land is restored. At that point, there will be return. And at that point, the people who are there will return to the proper worship, and the land will be cleansed. So there are various aspects of responsibility here, and this is not an either or situation. It's a complex relationship to the land, which ultimately requires a proper restoration of the human disposition. That's what has to, at that point, the land can be reclaimed, both as patria and as terra. But it's a reordering of one's relationship. But what I want to say is that physicality of the land is not just an extra, it's not just a backdrop. It is, as Calvin uses in the language there, it is the theater in which all of this carries out. And the landscape, the physicality of the world that the people encounter is a manifestation of the divine will. God is, in a way, speaking through that. Speaking through that landscape, but speaking through that experience, and so there's an animation to the physical world, which is deeply connected to the notion of patria with all its different. So I think, I don't know if this is going in your direction, but it's what I take from this is that it's a complex set of relationships, that there are not easy answers that you can pull out of this.
Yes, Max Sangamar, thank you very much, Bruce, for your paper. And you give to think, so I think it's the best way. And with the difference between Calvin and Zwingli, and I realized it when you spoke, it's Zwingli was a stranger, but not exactly an exile.
Yes.
An exile
yeah.
in Zurich.
That's right.
And Geneva and Calvin was an exile.
Yeah.
And with his children, Zwingli gave the name of Regula to one of his daughter, and she married Rudolf Walter, and they gave also the name of Regula, and Regula was the patroness of the city.
Yes.
And when Calvin with Idelette had a child, they called him Jacques, but not Peter. Pierre. So just
that's wonderful.
I was not cautious about that, but it's really
it's wonderful. That's wonderful. Regula, Felix and Regula are the saints of whose relics at the Reformation are removed from the Grossmünster and buried in some unknown place. But the name, similar to in some ways in Geneva, the names remain to this day. In Zurich, popular names and with close identity. This is right, and it's absolutely right. I mean, he's not an exile in anything like the same way that Calvin is. Rather that I'm making the point that he frequently speaks of himself as having been forced out of his. Because of the hostilities in Toggenburg, and so he rather chooses in a kind of more rhetorical way to present himself as an exile from his homeland. It's not the same circumstance that Calvin has, where he's forced to leave France. But I hadn't thought about that, but that's a wonderful thing with the naming of the children afterwards. You're absolutely right. But he doesn't have this tradition of associating Zwingli with Zurich is problematic. He doesn't have a sense of Zurich as really as his place. He regards him as having this kind of whether it is a kind of rhetorical thing or not, he continually, right up to the end of his life, presents himself in his correspondence and his writings as an outsider in this community.
But yeah, and the other common questions. So I was invited a decade ago on a colloquium about the little patria.
Yeah.
As you know, it comes from Ovid, who was put in exile also.
Yeah.
And so I tried to go through all French Reform poets, also reformer, with Viret and Orbe, Beza and Vézelay, Calvin and Noyon. So you have the distinctions between patria, small patria, and the kingdom. And the city of Geneva is not for Calvin or for Beza the perfect city. It's more a media patria. So the distinction, and I think the quotation in the preface of the Prefectiones to Daniel, it's more the small patria than the patria, because he's writing to his fellows in Noyon, to the council.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's wonderful.
Great. Yeah, I think, I'm sorry, I think we're out of time. We don't want to get held up and not go to the coffee, so perhaps you can ask Bruce at the end. I want, before we thank the speaker and I turn this over to Corinne for announcements about the rest of the program, I want to take a moment to, it's our last plenary session, before we thank Bruce, to thank everyone who made all the plenary sessions go well, from the sound tech to the question and answer.